over the last month, the Russians have made an increased scale of tactical gains in the east, particularly in Donetsk Oblast. West of Avdiivka, which fell back in February, the Russians have managed to advance a little above 5-6 kilometers or so. They've captured a handful of small tactical villages in the area, and they've also made some advances to the west of Bakhmut. They've been capturing some villages there as well and advancing towards a town called Chasiv Yar. I'm not particularly concerned about the Russian gains at this time, to be frank. I think there's a whole lot of negativity and low morale that's spreading because of these territorial losses, but in the grand scheme of things, they're really not that small. Most of these villages were captured in the course of April, and between April 1st and May 1st, the Russians only gained a grand total of about 75 square kilometers, or a little bit above the size of Manhattan. And they've not been any kind of operationally significant gains that threaten to fundamentally unhinge Ukraine's ability to defend the rest of the province, Donetsk Oblast. What I will say is it seems that the Russians are, in fact, expediting and intensifying their offensive operations at this time specifically in order to capitalize on this increasingly shrinking window of opportunity before the American-provided aid actually reaches the front lines and stabilizes it. Of course, the bill was passed a couple weeks ago, but it's going to take a couple more weeks for the ammunition and the aid to actually reach the front lines at scale.
So we're now entering, in your view, a really crucial window where if Russia is going to launch a new ground offensive, it's going to come very soon.
Yeah, the chief of the general staff, Valery Gerasimov, his whole modus operandi is to try to exploit these windows of opportunity, and that includes conducting and committing to offensive operations and attacks before the Russians have had adequate time and resourcing to fully prepare for them, because for the Russians, they understand that sometimes the conditions on the battlefield and the tempo sometimes dictate when it is the best time for you to actually make your move, not your ability to optimally prepare and get up to that desired strength that you need to be to do what you have to do.
And what do you think that Russian ground offensive may look like? I know the ISW has pointed out that Russia seems to be amassing quite a significant force in the Kursk Oblast. Is that with a view to looking at northeastern Ukraine and the area around Kharkiv?
Sure. Well, I want to make a point of differentiation. There already is a major Russian offensive ongoing now. Ever since the end of March 2024, we've seen the Russians actually intensify the tempo of their fighting and operations. The previous sort of lowest common denominator for previous Russian assaults were these meat assaults, unmanned, dismounted infantry without vehicle support, trying to make these very tactical gains crossing fields. But increasingly, we've seen the Russians, like I said, since late March, conducting these platoon-sized and company-sized frontal assaults with vehicle support. So with some tanks, with more mechanized equipment, and that was a notable inflection. That trend has continued. We're also forecasting the potential for a new major Russian offensive effort, which is separate from the ongoing offensive effort in Donetsk, like you said, which could be possibly targeting northeast Ukraine. We've collected a variety of indicators that indicate that the Russians have been redeploying significant forces to that southwestern corner of Russia, northeastern Ukraine, in Kursk Oblast, in Bryansk Oblast, and in Belgorod Oblast. And approximately the Russians have about 50,000 forces there, according to open source Ukrainian estimates. We're very concerned about the possibility that either in late May or early June, the Russians may decide to commit to some form of an offensive effort aimed at Kharkiv Oblast, or potentially aimed at seizing Kharkiv city. We assess that the Russians will fail in any attempt to seize Kharkiv city. They simply don't have the strength and the manpower to do this. They attempted it previously back in February and March 2022, back when the Russian military was in a much stronger position, and they failed then. So they're less likely to do so now. But that's not the point. We're concerned that the Russian general staff, they have a campaign design that's deliberately intended to try to fix Ukrainian forces across the theater. And if you look at the map of the battlefield right now, the main offensive effort for the Russians clearly is Donetsk Oblast. That's where they're sending most of their forces. And if the Russians open up a new front in the northeast against Kharkiv, that will naturally force the Ukrainians to make some difficult political and military decisions about what kind of resources do they redeploy from the east to focus on defending Kharkiv. And that could, unfortunately, stretch the Ukrainians thin and potentially facilitate facilitate the likelihood of a larger Russian breakthrough in the east in Donetsk. And we think that is the thing that we're really concerned about in this potential Russian attack in the northeast.
Do you think there is any prospect, George, of a Ukrainian counteroffensive in 2024?
It's entirely dependent on two key variables, and those are Western weapon provisions to Ukraine. Do they come in sufficient volumes, and do they come on a sufficient timeline to enable the Ukrainians to do so? And the second key variable is Ukraine's own force generation. Will the Ukrainians be able to restore their combat effectiveness for their existing brigades? And will the Ukrainians be successful in the formation of approximately 10 new brigades that they're in the process of forming now? If both of those conditions are correct and true, aid comes in time and high enough volume, and two, the Ukrainians get to reconstitute their force, then yes, there are opportunities for the Ukrainians to conduct, I think, limited counteroffensive operations in late 2024. But I want to talk a little bit about the importance of the Ukrainians conducting a counteroffensive. The counteroffensive doesn't exist for the sake of the counteroffensive. The counteroffensive is much more important in terms of long-term, higher-level operational planning and campaign design. Because if the Ukrainians do not do any sort of active operations, they do not perform something active, and I'm not talking about a massive, large, decisive counteroffensive like how was planned in 2023. What it does is it de facto cedes the military initiative to the Russian military. And that means that the Russians get to present the Ukrainians a series of bad options. Do you defend Donetsk, or do you defend against a new offensive in Kharkiv? And if, God forbid, the Russians decide to open up a new offensive elsewhere in Ukraine, then it forces the Ukrainians to contort themselves in all kinds of directions and spread themselves thin in order to just react to the Russians. And the Russians, if they're skillful in how they employ their own campaign design, they will deliberately create these dilemmas so that 6 months from now, so that 18 months from now, so that 24 months from now, the Ukrainians will be in a much weaker spot. The only way for the Ukrainians to break out of this is by messing up the Russian plan and, in fact, imposing some dilemmas on the Russians that force the Russians to make a decision about where to prioritize Russian resources, about how to defend the territory that the Russians hold, even if it's in a small, limited sort of way. And the proponents of saying, 2025 is the magical year in which the Ukrainians must conduct a counteroffensive then for whatever reason, that implicitly says we're okay with ceding the initiative to Ukraine for all of ceding the initiative to the Russians for all of 2024. And generally in warfare, whoever holds the initiative for the longer period of time or the most, they have the advantage. And so what we've been trying to do at the Institute is educate people about the importance of campaign design, of the operational art, and also the importance of the military initiative. And the Ukrainians should try to contest that, even if it's in a limited way.
For sake of argument, say it is late 2024 that Ukraine is in a position to launch some counteroffensive operations. What do you think their tactical and operational objectives should be until then?
Yeah. Until then, their tactical objectives should be to attrit the Russian military as much as possible, eliminate and destroy as much Russian combat power as possible, and hold on to the operationally significant territories that the Ukrainians are currently defending. Right now, the Russians are gunning for some very operationally significant tactical objectives in Donetsk Oblast. If the viewers look at a map of the northern section of Donetsk Oblast to the immediate sort of northwest vicinity of Bakhmut, there's a series of large Ukrainian cities: Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Drushkivka, Konstantinivka. The latter of which, Konstantinivka, is only about 6 kilometers away from the current front line at Chasiv Yar. Those are very large cities. Each of those are roughly, if not more, than twice the size of Bakhmut. And I think we all remember how arduous the urban campaign for Bakhmut was. Those are what we call them sort of Ukrainian fortress cities because they're extremely difficult to capture, and whoever holds them will have a massive defender benefit. And we're concerned that if the Russians manage to needle their way past Chasiv Yar and work their way into the chain of those closely dispositioned to each other fortress cities, then the Russians might be able to work their way and try to peel off Konstantinivka, the southernmost city in that chain, and try to systematically dismantle that Ukrainian defense. If the Ukrainians manage to survive and defend off Russian attacks to get into those operationally significant cities, then the Ukrainians will be in a much better place to defend the rest of Donetsk Oblast. If the Ukrainians lose those cities, then we're getting into the territory of looking at some very significant operational changes and some territory that will be very difficult for the Ukrainians to liberate in the future.
Just finally, George, given that and given the ongoing threat of a fresh Russian ground offensive, is May 2024 one of the most important months of this war?
I think it will be one of the most important months. The situation is very dire. We're at a position here where the Russians have learned a lot of lessons from their failed offensive operations. They are innovating. They have incorporated the glide bombs in a fundamentally new way to have the Air Force, which has largely not played a very active role in the war so far, but to play a key supporting role to enable Russian maneuver on the ground. We've broken out of the stage of positional warfare. I think we were all talking about how there was a so-called stalemate. I never agreed it was a stalemate, but we had a positional nature of the war when the battle lines locked down back in September. But the Russians they've broken out of it through economic power, through their ability to generate more soldiers, through military learning and innovation at the operational level of war. The Russians are restoring maneuver to the battlefield. The Ukrainians are currently at one of the lowest points that they've been at in terms of their strength, both because they're attrited and tired from fighting, and they need a much badly required resupply, which is now thankfully on the way. And so I think the lines are going to stabilize in the coming weeks, but this particular next 4 to 6 weeks, it's going to be a very challenging period. But the light's at the end of the tunnel, and as long as we can evade disaster, which I think is not that likely, the Ukrainians' prospects are going to turn up.
Thank you for watching Frontline for Times Radio. For more, click subscribe on our YouTube channel. You can listen to Times Radio, and you can read more about the war in Ukraine and global security with your Times digital subscription.